listening to the 14th source for all geeky and nerdy news and discussion, which means that you're listening to a podcast.
For all intents and purposes.
I am D. Bethel.
And I'm Andrew Asplund.
And we are your two overeducated, codependent nerd hosts, bringing you the things that we want to talk about, but filtered through inquisitive and critical lenses. In the episode for Friday, February 25th, 2022. We missed the, just because it didn't land on a Friday. The February, that month. We missed February 22nd, 2022. 2222.
But it was actually on Tuesday, so
it was on Tuesday, so it was even better.
It was a Tuesday.
Right? Woo! So lots of people posting like Two-Face memes, meaning the Batman villain. But
a meme that turns on you after you look at it.
Right. But it was a bigger week this week than just that, because as fans of the show will know, this is the week that Final Fantasy VI Pixel Remaster released onto the world. After delays, after anticipation, after questions. And what we can confirm at the very least is that it is, 1.6 gigabytes?
Yeah, 1.5 gigabytes was the download, which we're not going to talk about Final Fantasy today, because I know if we do, at least, one listener will just turn off the podcast. But it's just remarkable that a 1.5 gigabyte download for a game that when it first came out was probably 16 or 32 megabytes at max.
Which still made it more expensive because they had to include extra memory in the fucking cart.
Right,
or something.
It was
like
an extra big Super Nintendo game.
Right, that and Chrono Trigger.
And there's lots of reasons why. I mean, there's lots of art, there's whatever. It's interesting that, when you consider that, like, in the era of video games in the early 90s, especially console games, space size was a premium, right? You read stories about these early programmers of like games just like doing their best to make the cram as much on there, and now it's just like whatever, it'll take a little longer to download.
That actually opens up sort of the one thing I didn't know about the Pixel remasters is that, and it makes sense considering the world of sort of legacy re-releases. I think of like the Mega Man Legacy Collection. I think about the Disney Afternoon Collection that was released across platforms. But you just let me know that the Pixel remasters are not just the remastered games, but there's like galleries and music players and whatnot. What other kind of extra stuff are they shoving in there aside from like graphical and musical and audio updates? Yeah,
that's it.
Oh, okay.
No, I mean, there's like a gallery where they have a lot of original art, the art from like, character sketches and stuff. A music player, and all the music, they're all, I think they're all actual recordings, right? Right. That's actually a really interesting thing.
What do you mean?
Consider the music for the game is actually, it's like pre-recorded. It's not, like in 1990...
Live music.
Yeah, in 1992 or 93, it was just a MIDI sequence, right?
Right. Using a keyboard and a bunch of different layers, yeah.
but using the Super Nintendo sound processor. Now it's like, this is, you're hearing what was, recorded by Nobuo Uematsu, whether, he sequenced it out of his own system or whatever. But like, I think that's, and that's just because, again, space is not a big deal. So having like a 4 megabyte audio file is like not the end of the world, right? I mean, when you think about it, the music alone is like 10 times the size of the original game. Yeah.
Right.
But anyway, yeah, and there's some images, a gallery of art. There's a bestiary. Once you find the monsters, you can see them.
I know you're going against your personal instincts because you like to call it a bestiary because that's how it's spelled.
I call it both ways.
Oh. Because I don't know. I think right, and also English is dumb, but it's interesting. I think actually hearing like there's like image galleries and of collecting concept art and stuff like that is actually not enticing for me because along the way I bought all those books.
Have all that art.
I have all that shit, right? And I guess it'd be cool to see it in 1080p on my TV screen or whatever, or on my computer monitor. But like, I could also just look at the book that I have. Right. But from what I've heard, like the music does sound pretty good, if not super different. And I'm just saying that for Final Fantasy VI. They released this video to that displayed their remix of the track called The Decisive Battle. And it did sound good. It sounded clear, not tinny, not compressed at all. And of course, a lot of extra sort of like, layers and instruments that weren't there in the original. But it sounded pretty close to the original. So it sounds good. Like, it sounds like the game is going to be good because, especially as we've expressed on this show, the previous Pixel remasters have been good. You and I have been skeptical to an extent on the Final Fantasy VI remaster. Like, skeptical to the point of like, what are they going to do? Mm-hmm. And now it's here, and we'll find out, I guess, because you have it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do.
And
I do.
What have you played so far?
It's like 20 minutes, but we're not here to talk about Final Fantasy. We're not here to talk about Final Fantasy.
Well, then I'm done. Good night.
Yeah. No, we're not here to talk about Final Fantasy. We'll talk about it some other day, maybe.
Can we at least talk about RPGs?
Yes, we can. So it's funny. This last week saw a bit of a news announcement from a tabletop role-playing game publisher.
Okay.
That was met with... no, not WotC. Cubicle 7. They're a company based out of the United Kingdom. So they made an announcement on, I believe it was Friday.
Okay.
Or maybe it was Thursday. I don't remember.
Last Friday, not today.
We're right. A week ago.
Yes.
Where they had announced that they had some news about the second edition of their Doctor Who role-playing game. But they also announced a kind of an unexpected release. I believe they kind of referred to it as Doctors and Daleks.
Right.
An alternative version of the Doctor Who role-playing game that uses the variation of the Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition rule set.
Okay, so
they announced it on the Twitters.
The safest place.
Yes, the safest place to have. Well, I mean, I've had very positive experiences with RPG Twitter. However, this was an interesting response because there were a lot of you can go back and look at it. Well, I don't know if you do like a time thing, but it's amazing that the way the exchange goes is they make this announcement, and then a lot of people are basically saying, "What?"
Right, and like all they posted was like a preview image, basically saying it was the Doctor Who logo with Doctors and Daleks in that font and stuff like that, and then it said 5e beneath it. That's all it was. It wasn't like a link to a page.
No, there was nothing. It was just that they'd said that they were doing Dungeons and Dragons Doctor Who.
And you said people come out and were negative.
There was a wave of people who came out with kind of the response was, why would you use this rule set for a game about Doctor Who? And that kind of reaction is like, wow, is this the best choice? And there was, I think, also some reactions of oh, I see, you're there to make the money, right? Cashing in, I believe maybe is the term. No, selling out. I don't know what whatever. They're just there to make money, right? It was a lot of people had a lot of opinions about it. And in general, to summarize the main argument is that Dungeons and Dragons generally has a pretty heavy focus on combat. Right? It is Dungeons and Dragons. It's a game you always associate with going into dungeons, killing monsters, and stealing their treasure. Something which feels very antithetical to what maybe Doctor Who is about, right?
What are you talking about? I want to min-max my Time Lord.
Yeah, I want to attack the Daleks, kill Davros, and steal his treasure
while doing a backflip and throwing a dagger.
And so there was that kind of reaction, and then a lot of the developers, the people that either work or worked at Cubicle 7 yes. started responding directly. And this is the reason why I kind of got involved, because I noticed something weird about it. At least what I thought was weird. Apparently it's just absolutely normal.
Right. And that's the thing. That's why we're talking about this, is like, we don't really report on... Well, we have
controversy,
controversy, or just news in its own right. We tend to comment on the discourse that's happening, the communication,
the discourse, yes,
the communication that is hopefully trying to accomplish a goal, the actual definition of discourse here. And that's where things got weird with this. Because otherwise we wouldn't report it, aside from the fact like, oh shit, like they're announcing a Doctor Who 5e edition, basically. But that's not the story we're talking about. We're talking about like the messaging around it is what got weird.
Well, it's for at least from my perspective, and I know I'm not the only person that thought this. Several other people also kind of point out that a lot of these developers they started responding, when people said, "Hey, maybe 5e isn't like the best choice." Their response was to say, "Oh no, we already have a game that there's another game system for Doctor Who that we also make," and repeatedly, multiple people referred to that game system as bespoke. It's our bespoke game system, and that was actually the comment I actually.
Those people that actually make the game. They were saying.
People that make the game were saying, "Oh, we already have a bespoke game system," and it stood out as weird because the perspective I saw, what I thought, and I tweeted about it, and I got responses from these people saying, "No, you're wrong." It had all the feelings of a company where management tells you to go onto your personal Twitter and say canned dialogue, right? Like, because bespoke is not something I've ever heard used to refer to a role-playing game in my life.
Bespoke meaning bespoke tends to mean like custom made, like products, like one of a kind, unique. Yeah.
Yeah, and I get, in retrospect, I think how they're using it in the context of, we made this role-playing game system explicitly for Doctor Who. But it was weird.
If anything, I would call that previous system like a proprietary, like Doctor Who system. Like we made the system for a Doctor Who role-playing system, but then we're also doing a 5e. Yeah.
But it was just, it was weird because multiple people using the term bespoke. So I commented on that. And honestly, even the next day, they came, one of their creative director came back. And again, in discussing what happened, used the word bespoke to describe it.
And we have them on the show right now. So go ahead and look. No, we don't. No, we don't.
Really what happened was it turned into what social media turns into is, company announces product, people respond with some, with a wide range of emotional responses. And then, the people come back with this, defensively, which I get, right? You spend a lot of time working on something like this. You take pride in it. You don't want people to say that this is stupid. But it just kept turning over, right? Because then suddenly you have a lot of people that, I'll say it may have been one of the best marketing things to happen to them, because they even said a lot of people now know about their game, and a lot of people have basically pledged to buy the 5e version when it comes out because of how poorly the developers were treated on Twitter. I think it was a weird situation. First of all, because social media is Twitter, Facebook. They're all these inhumane places where you don't really have any. There's no humanity. It's inhumane. But it's just this idea that kind of responses to, was this the best choice for a game system? Kind of is met with people, the personal people involved coming on and defending it, which then in some contexts is met with some skepticism, like, oh wow, are you being told to do this? That was, that's what I thought. It really felt like, wow, you guys are being ordered to go on and defend this. What I thought was a pretty poor choice of system for a role playing game. And then for them to turn that into like this, oh man, we were so proud of this and we've never felt more hurt. That we've been so, and then for people then to turn around and say, oh my gosh, these designers did such great work, so mean of people to judge it before it came out, I'm going to support this game. As someone who was ostensibly part of it, the whole thing feels like, was I in a scripted event?
Right. Were you played, Andrew?
Was I?
Are you a shill?
But it is interesting because it does. There are conversations to be had, and it really demonstrates how social media is not for the discourse. That's why there's this joke on Twitter where a lot of people, at least in RPG Twitter, will refer to the disc horse, right? And even use like emoji of a disc and a horse.
Well, I see.
Right.
Is that horse armor? I'm not sure.
Right.
Do I have to pay for this? Is that what's going on?
And it does really come back to this idea that, at least for me, that places like Facebook and Twitter really, although even you can't even have like little patches and isolated communities of people who have kind of discussions, it's not really a place for discussions.
Right.
But I will say that the conversation continued throughout the weekend.
Yeah.
And it expanded because then suddenly people, some of which who work at Wizards of the Coast, started saying, no one told me that this game that I design is only about combat. I guess I've been playing it wrong this whole time. Okay. At least one Wizards employee said that, which is, this is always a discussion about Dungeons & Dragons. Is it all about the fights or not? Well, some people play it with no fights, And heck, there's even one person I know, actually a writer I know, who literally sat down and there's multiple versions of this. One person counted pages that had combat shit on it and said, look, here's, another person went through the entire book and said, is this a combat thing or not? To try to somehow show, that it was or was not combat focused.
It's a bit petty.
I mean, the whole, it's this whole discussion, and it is petty, but I think what it really highlights is, because I think one of the responses from a lot of people was, gosh, people that hate 5e, they're so gross, like, why do they hate 5e? And on the other hand, there's this group of people who say the fact that they'd make a Doctor Who 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons role-playing game just tells you how ever-present Dungeons and Dragons it is and how hard it is to get out of that shadow.
Or they're just Eric Sayward fans, and they want the Doctor to shoot people to death. Right.
Well, this... because it's funny, because the original Doctor Who game, kind of one of its novel points was that when there's an encounter that could have combat, initiative is determined, like who goes first is determined on what you're doing, where talkers go first, other, so whatever goes second, runners go third, and fighters go last. But I think there is a really interesting point about how, and they even said, the company said, like, when people say, like, oh, you guys you're just trying to cash in on 5e, they basically said yes, right? Sure. They are.
Yeah.
Because
it's a company's job to make money. Like,
and as it ends up, you put a 5e version out. Like the company had previously had the license to Lord of the Rings, and they'd done their own Lord of the Rings game, and then they did a 5th edition Lord of the Rings game, and that one sold better, right? It just sold better. Yeah. And they actually found that their argument was that some people that bought that 5th edition game didn't even know there was another game, but then found out about it, right? And that's actually kind of the argument here, is that a lot of people complaining about Doctor Who 5th edition D&D didn't know there was a bespoke Doctor Who role-playing game, and now they do, of course, but
maybe,
or they don't. But it is this thing where you see, because the same discussion happened like a month ago or 2 months ago when a company announced, when they revealed that there's a Dark Souls tabletop role-playing game coming out, and it is using a variant of the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons rule set. Right, even though there was already a Dark Souls role-playing game in Japan, which some people have actually said was a mechanically interesting game. But instead of, translating that to English and bringing it to the United States, or to Europe and the United States, they chose instead to take Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition and crank it into what worked for Dark Souls, which... I actually don't play Dark Souls, but there's a lot of discussion. Is D&D a good choice for Dark Souls? What did they have to change to make it work? I
mean, it sounds like, actually, from what I know of Dark Souls and like the whole From Software games, like you might want something more punishing, like maybe 1st edition or 2nd edition.
Well, and that's what they kind of had to do and add some, but it's always that thing, right? Like, there's also a discussion that some of the older folks had that I wasn't quite in the, I wasn't playing Dungeons and Dragons at the time, but in the 2000s, there was a very similar feel, what a lot of people call the D20 glut, right? When 3rd edition came out in 2001, they made the open game license and the D20 system. And it was like every swinging dick in the room had a D&D or a D20 version of their game.
Right.
Like that was the thing you did, right? There was a World of Warcraft D20 game. There was an EverQuest D20 game. There's a Stargate D20 game. Comically, there's another one now, a 5th edition one.
For full, not disclosure, but you've written a fair amount about Open Game License (OGL).
The OGL's big
blogs
crock.
and stuff
Let's
like
not,
that.
let's not dig up that old horse.
Why not? I mean, but yeah. Look in the show notes, dear listeners. Boom.
But I mean, the big thing was that there was this kind of idea that there was a flood, right? And the thing is, it wasn't even, some of it was bad, right? It was just like, you get a license, slap it on a D20 game, and you get stuff that's like kind of bizarre, right? Like, oh, I guess this is, a D20 game, but like, how do you play Dungeons and Dragons with, the Cosby Show, right?
And I guess we should say like
there's no Cosby Show.
So it's Cosby Show RPG. Yeah. No, especially now.
Cheers
it's
RPG.
Incredibly traumatic. But the idea is that D&D. So they released a new edition of D&D, but it's built on this sort of game system for D20 is based around sort of rolling D20s, right? 20-sided die, and similarly. 5th edition, Dungeons and Dragons is built on this recent edition, but like the mechanics is kind of what they're licensing. It doesn't like it's
they're
not
not licensing; they're just using.
Okay. So
no license required.
Actually, so is that like problematic at all legally or no?
No. Well, technically, you can use the OGL because they say that, but like you don't even need to, right?
Right.
Mechanics are not copyrightable. You're just trying to get me to talk about the OGL. I see what you're doing. You're baiting me.
No. I'm just trying to explain like the difference between like how we're shoehorning Doctor Who into Dungeons and Dragons versus like, oh no, we're just taking their system and providing campaigns and books on top of that.
So if you imagine like the basic game mechanics and gameplay of Dungeons and Dragons, right? Rolling a d20 to attack a monster, comparing it to armor class, rolling dice for damage, having 6 ability scores or some number of ability scores.
The mechanical aspects of it.
The mechanical aspects, that's 5e, right? That's what you'll see when they say, oh, it's 5e based. So like the Stargate role-playing game, you're still leveling up your little Stargate person, and you're still rolling d20s and attacking and stuff. But instead of fighters and wizards, it's, soldiers and scientists. So in Doctor Who, instead of fighters and wizards, it'll be doctors and apprentices
Daleks,
or whatever.
Apparently, yeah.
And Daleks, yeah. But it's and the thing is, one of the there's a lot of discussion about it because one of these arguments and boy oh boy, people are still talking about it this week, right? This idea that like, well, people don't want to learn new games, right? Like, and that is an argument that's made. And then kind of the contrary is that, well, it's hard because, if you go to most game stores, they only have D&D, right?
Sure, yeah. The sort of homogenization of tabletop role-playing.
And there's some discussion threads that whether or not this is the intent, it's to the point where it's like D&D is a role-playing game, is synonymous with the idea of playing a role-playing game.
Right.
It's a platform, it's not a game.
Right.
And so that makes it hard because if you have a game that isn't D&D or is actually, decidedly different than D&D, you get pushback. It's like, oh, this isn't D&D. Like I didn't roll a D20 to attack the monster. I rolled 6 six-sided dice or, whatever the case may be. And so that's why, that this kind of thing, you see this and I guess it's interesting because, a lot of indie developers, like you'll see people that make stuff for D&D and they say like, if I don't make it for D&D, it doesn't sell.
And when you say make it for D&D, do you mean just using the 5th edition rule set, or do you mean like plugging it into the lore or the world?
More just using 5th, like if, so good example is you'll see people doing Kickstarters for rule supplements, adventures, story, content to play. And they'll always and so I play Pathfinder 2nd edition, right? And I've seen materials and content that come out that are actually very clearly for Pathfinder, right? One of them was...
Is that still technically a 3.75D or something?
No, it's now it's its own thing now. They built their own system.
Gotcha.
Although it's still, there's a lot of similarities, but it is distinct. It's their own thing. But like I said, there was a Kickstarter. Was it Roll for Combat's Battle Zoo Bestiary? Right. It was just a monster book with some new rules. And even though it was one of the designers literally built Pathfinder Second Edition, one of the other people that worked on it was another Pathfinder designer or employee. Even though it was clearly a Pathfinder product, when they kickstarted it, they had a 5e and a Pathfinder option.
Yeah.
Right. And the idea that they went to the process of figuring out, I don't know if they hired someone to make it or if they had another team develop the 5e version because that sells books.
That's interesting. Yeah.
There's an adventure that was being kickstarted by a guy that works on Fantasy Age, that works on Starfinder, and it had an adventure written by the lead developer at Paizo for Adventures, a fellow named Ron Lundeen. He writes this adventure, and I'm pretty confident they had their Kickstarter had Pathfinder and 5th edition, right? Again. Right. Because you put the 5th edition on there because that's what sells.
Yeah, right.
So it's understandable.
It is understandable because 5e brought in a lot of players to tabletop role-playing game, and it's a system it's a system they understand, which, in theory, it shouldn't be too hard to learn other systems, but maybe it's a statement on the industry when, you have to do that because it is too difficult to learn other systems, which it probably isn't. You would know better than I. But I think the question I kind of maybe more want to end on or get to is with regard to Doctor Who, and because you have familiarity, at least reading about the bespoke role-playing game and understanding kind of how people are kowtowing to Dungeons & Dragons 5e. Where are you falling on this argument? Or not necessarily, I'm not asking you to pick a side. That's rude and sort of reductive. But with regard to, especially Doctor Who, but with regard to developing 4-5e, where are you what's your opinion on this? If people are playing 5e, why not keep those people? That's kind of my outsider opinion. But I'm also of the idea, game developers like to develop games and come up with systems. It's not just the lore that they're developing. They like coming up with how to play a game as well. And there's arguments for both, I could see. What's your kind of angle on this whole conversation, especially as our podcast's representative for tabletop role-playing games?
I mean, it's different people play or write or create role-playing games in different ways for different reasons, right? And one of the things that I've thought a lot about this because all these people talking about how D&D is the staple of the industry, and I was thinking about how much I've historically really disliked D&D as a game. When I was in the 90s playing, I bought D&D books like you did when you were a nerdy kid in the 90s. And I had friends that played, and there's a point where I very quickly decided, actually, I think this game sucks. But I like the idea of role-playing games. I just want to find one that isn't shitty. So this, by the way, this was Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition, which I have a friend who I think summed it up well. What was great about AD&D 2nd Edition is it was so bad you learned how to write your own rules.
Right.
But I ended up playing a lot of other games, and I was very lucky. I had a friend in middle school and high school who basically was getting weird role-playing games from his older brother and friends. So he was getting all this other stuff, and so he introduced me to a whole other array of role-playing games. So I realized I didn't like D&D in the 90s. And then when I went into the Navy and I came back in 2009 and I started playing D&D again, and at that point it was 4th edition. And I was like, well, I'll give D&D a try because this is new. And I really enjoyed 4th edition.
Yeah, you did.
The joke being that no one else did. And then when 5th edition came out, it went back to what I didn't like. It reminded me of the game that I cast off as a kid. So for me, it's that thing where I don't like the fact that this version of the game that I don't enjoy playing is what everyone plays.
Right.
I've tried it 4 or 5 times, and every time I feel like, wow, I might be wasting my time playing this. But a lot of people really enjoy it. And it does get people in the industry, to play these games, or at least ostensibly it does.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that's bad just because it's 5e. Like, it's just a system. And that's the thing that's interesting to me. Maybe because I just played with... When I was playing D&D, it was like in high school. And I'm not a good tabletop role-playing game player. But I don't... I think the most recent time I played D&D, it was a pre-written adventure. Mm-hmm. But every other experience I had before then was just like, yeah, here's the D&D rules. I'm going to make my own thing. And kind of the discourse I'm seeing around this is like I thought that was the norm. Like, tell your own story and just kind of like shoehorn it into how many dice you roll. But maybe that's not how a lot of people play now. But I always figured D&D was just a platform. You learn the rules so you can use it as a platform for your own expression, for your own storytelling, for your own creativity. Beyond just like, I'm going to do a backflip and throw a dagger at the same time. Like, it's a place for DMs to create their own worlds. But maybe I just had either a blessed or a cursed. Honestly. Because I remember one of my early D&D adventures, we had a whole group of like 6 people around a table, and we kept rolling low numbers. And so our dwarf in the team, as we were trying to get into a boat to cross a river, the dwarf rolled low and felt he had to ask, "What's a boat?" Which didn't seem... Which killed the verisimilitude of the experience a little bit.
Well, but, that happens a lot, and that's
sure,
that's
especially with teenagers and all that shit.
Well, and adults actually, surprisingly enough, yeah.
What's a boat? What's a democracy?
To watch, people like embrace like the idea that this brilliant hero that you've fashioned in your mind is actually a complete putz. Well, and it's. And I kind of go back to this idea that different people really play in different ways. And that's the one thing is that, like, I argue sometimes I see some of these games where, they'll play for 2 hours and do very little, how do I put this? They don't engage with the rules much at all.
Right.
And there's, one camp saying, well, they're not really playing the role-playing game at that point. They're just playing a game, make believe, which is fine.
Fine, yeah, as long as they're having fun.
Yeah,
but honestly,
it is. But it is. There, and this is again. There's a lot of ever going to never ending debates about this. Does it count as playing the game? Like, people say, oh well, we played D&D and there were no combats at all. Like, and that's totally
you weren't
fine.
Playing D&D. How dare you?
Well, I mean, you are kind of, but I would argue like you are kind of disregarding 60 to 70% of the established rules.
But are you playing a game with your friends?
And are you having fun?
Yeah.
And so it is okay. And the one thing I do think of as well, when people say that they kind of talk about the transcendence of D&D, I do like to think about the Kickstarter by Mongoose Publishing, I believe they are. No,
sure,
I forget what they're called. I have one of their packages around here. I was going to look at, but they got the license for Avatar: The Last Airbender, right?
Okay,
and they did that Kickstarter. That Kickstarter was enormous, right? It was
sure,
like $9 million. They were literally writing about how they're going to run out of paper in the United States,
right? Probably because people thought it was the James Cameron Avatar series, and like, whoa, save the magic
and the thing
tree.
is, it was not a D&D based game. It does not use the 5e rule set. It was
a bespoke rule set?
No, it used it's a variation of Apocalypse World.
Okay.
No, it's not. It was not. Well, it's somewhat bespoke. They did develop some stuff for it, but I think what it gets to is this idea that there is room for people to learn other games.
Right.
There is room for people to, and there are people who who are interested in that. I mean, I can't imagine that $9 million was kickstarted towards Avatar by people who are going to be like, oh, this isn't 5th edition. I don't know how to play it.
Right.
Although there's probably going to be at least some of those.
Gosh, yeah. And it seems like smart. I don't want to say, I don't even want to attribute to business sense, but like, if you have a license, why not and you have employees, why not make it available in as many forms as possible? Like, whether it's porting a game you developed for one system to any other system you can play. Like, I'm not talking about like video games here. Like, you develop a game specifically for, let's just say, PC, but then you either, adapt that so it can play on console systems, or you hire a company to do that port.
To do that, right.
Right. Why not do that? Because you want people to play your game. Well, you paid a lot of money in theory for a license as well. But it's it is expensive, but it also gets people to engage with the property. And it gives people options to play the game they want to play. Now, not saying you can't play any game you want to play, no matter the system you want. Like 5e, like the 5e cops aren't going to kick in the door if you decide to have no combat, right? They'll do that online.
I don't know about that. Yeah,
but they won't come in and kick in the door to your home, and say, "We're dragging you to TTRPG jail."
Well, and the one thing though that is you see this come up a lot is that different games, in games generally, right? But in tabletop role playing games, different rules emphasize different things. They focus on different parts of play, different experiences, and that can be important, right?
Yes.
I always reference the popular indie role playing game Dread. I forget the creator's name.
Metroid.
But it was published by Evil Hat Games, I believe. And the whole thing with Dread is it was a single session horror game where the idea is that your characters are going to die, and the primary game mechanic, the way that questions were resolved, was with a Jenga tower. And if the tower is, so like if you were going to do something for which success wasn't certain, you draw a tile from the tower, and if it collapses, that's when your character dies, right? And I'll tell you, it creates, because of Jenga, there's a certain amount of tension.
Sure.
And, when these things come up, because it not only is the character in the game facing this uncertainty, so is your fat ass fingers trying to pull a Jenga tile out.
Right.
Well, guess what? I'm really bad at Jenga, and it collapsed on the first pull.
Right.
So my person died in the introduction of the movie.
Right. I'm just here to roll D6s and D20s, right?
Right, but so the way that you engage with games and how, and there's a lot of thought in discussion about this, and that's why there is this idea that you don't just make every game for every rule system, or if you do, maybe you take away something that made that made the game worth playing, right? And that's because, and I think the thing to realize that I think is that while originally a lot of these role-playing games had this very simulationist bent, right? Sure. You're just trying to simulate reality.
Right.
There's a lot more focus on game now, right? On
stylization and entertainment.
And how we create rules that get players to do things in certain ways.
Right.
To evoke the stories we want to do and to create the narratives that we want. I
want to say you have even talked on this very show about pulling pieces out of systems to create an adventure, a bespoke adventure, if you will.
Yes. The word's never going away.
No, it's definitely not. It is part of the discourse. Good discourse. The word discourse is never going away either at this point. But hey, look at all these systems. This would work for this situation, for this adventure, for this part of the campaign, whereas this other system would work for this other part of the campaign, and pulling all these things together to make the best experience for your players. That's the thing. It's playing tabletop role-playing games is an organic experience because it's a collaborative experience, right?
And just to I just want to further just illustrate this idea of mechanics that illustrate certain expectations of play, and I want to use it. I want to reference the bespoke Doctor Who system. This is for those that don't know Doctor Who. This is a story where you have a very capable, very competent main character. Being followed by less capable, less competent normal people, right? The Doctor and their companions,
right?
And there's a lot of people that when you hear well, how do you do that in in a role-playing game. Like, you have one person whose character is like level 50 and everyone else is level 2.
Who wants to play the dumb guys? You?
And the way that the original game did that is you have this meta currency, story points. And the idea is that the doctor has less. The doctor has more skills, more like capability to do things, but less story points. Whereas, Donna Noble or Rose Tyler or, whoever, they have more story points. And that story point is the player can spend to reroll dice, to shift things in their favor. So it's almost like you have control over, this is important. I'm going to spend the story points to make it happen. Whereas the doctor is just, I'm good at this, but I don't have a lot of, freedom to do things.
Right.
And so that's a way to try to capture that imbalance between characters. So that's why I say, like, the different the mechanics you engage with can really shift the way the game feels. One friend always says that D&D was always a game that you look at the cover and it shows these brave warriors fighting monsters, this epic battle, and then you sit down to play it and you get hit with a rock and die. And you're like, well, that wasn't the experience I saw on the cover, So that's just that kind of thing that why, like, mechanics maybe do matter, and why people, I think, get so heated about discussing them. So yeah. So check out a podcast for all intents and purposes 5e edition.
Just because we need to make money. We need to make money. Where
you have 2 classes, washed out professor and has been lawyer, and and you fight.
Check out the cover. Exciting adventures on the cover.
Yeah, exciting.
And it's only afterwards we will release the bespoke version.
Our bespoke version, which will actually just be a permutation of the Apocalypse World rule set.
Right.
And then later I'll do a Savage Worlds version because we just really need those bills, those dollar bills.
And honestly, like, it all comes down to one basic decision that you don't decide what to talk about until 5 minutes before you start. Anyway.
So, role-playing game Twitter.
It's a hot mess.
It's a hot mess, but
for a good reason.
Doctor Who role-playing games, both the second edition of their bespoke game rule system and a new 5e-based version are coming out this year, I believe. I actually think the second edition is supposed to be out. It was supposed to be out already, but, oops, supply lines in pandemic.
Oh, no.
So, check that out from Cubicle 7.
Nothing has been released, like, in terms of, has any, like, core books or core rule books been released for Doctor Who 5e?
No,
it was just the announcement. It was just the announcement. Okay, so all this bullshit and nothing to go on. Cool.
Right.
Cool. That sounds like Twitter to me. So, if you, dear listeners, have any thoughts about the topics we discussed this week, feel free to leave your thoughts as comments on the page for this episode at forallintents.net.
You can also post your comment or engage in conversations with other listeners on our Facebook page.
You can also find us on other social media where we are perhaps more engaging and engaged. On Twitter, you can find me at dbethel. You can find Andrew tweeting about and responding to RPG Twitter at Profound Dark. And you can find Andrew on Instagram as well as myself. But you can find Andrew at Profound Brick and me and my work at dbethel Comics.
While you're at our website at forallintents.net, you can also take a look at our YouTube page, which you can find by clicking on the link in the corner. Exciting news, we now have episodes of this podcast being ported to the YouTube page.
Not using any external service either. It's just, boom, it's there.
We're just so good.
Right, because the base system we use is so solid and useful for the players. Anyway, we use 2 tracks of music for our show. One is called Disco Medusae, the other is called District 4. Both written and performed by Kevin McLeod, the Clan McLeod, immortal swordsman, graph paper enthusiast, and musician extraordinaire.
You can find his music at incompetech.filmmusic.io, and that's all licensed under the Creative Commons 4.0 attribution license.
If you like the show and like to help us out, the best way to do so would be to subscribe to the show using whichever podcasting service you happen to use, whether it's something like the Apple Podcast app or YouTube or Spotify, a service which we are still on. But what would help us out even more would be to go to their storefront and leaving some sort of review, whether a text review or using the proprietary metric will help spread the word to new potential listeners to the magic of algorithms.
So yeah, big day, I guess, in RPG Twitter.
I guess so, man. We do what we can to stay on top of the headlines.
It's one of those things I will say, because I'm kind of like nobody, right? It was quite shocking to after I kind of questioned the use of the word bespoke.
Mm-hmm. You got some response?
Did my Twitter start blowing up? It's the first time I've ever had to, mute a thread.
Oh, dang.
Because it kept, people responding to it, people liking their responses. I attracted some attention. What can I say?
Did you have to block anybody? And more importantly, did you have to block anybody of note?
No, I didn't block anybody. It was interesting, though, to see one designer from one company who kind of agreed with me, and then having the designer from Cubicle 7 basically say, like, oh, other designer, even you? The response it's actually the response was pretty solid, because he said, look, I don't even know who you are. Yeah. I don't want to name any names. It was just to have like one designer who's like, again, published designer or developer, and another one, and one guy saying, oh, even you'd say this, and the guy's like, dude, I don't know who you are. If you want to message me privately, go ahead.
And you're just sitting there twiddling your thumbs, going like, oh boy.
Right. And I'm just thinking, hey, I made a mess.
So until you become an unwilling catalyst for hot Twitter debate, dear listeners, I'm D. Bethel.
And I'm Andrew Esplund.
And for all intents and purposes,
that was a podcast. Then I saw Celis's last name, and I'm like, what?
Don't tell me. Shh. Celis? Now we're taxing the limits of my memory.
I don't think I actually ever saw it before.
Celis, Tara Branford, Cyan Garamonde, Shadow Johnson.
Good old
Realm
Shadow Johnson.
Ted Woolsey had an agenda.
He did. Well, it's interesting because
his agenda was to get paid.
Yeah, to get fucking paid. By the way, did you know that Edgar's middle name is Roney?
Yes, I did.
It sounds like I did not know that either. It's Edgar.
Well,
Roney.
That's why Sabin's that's why Sabin's original Japanese middle name is Risa.
Macaroni and rice-a-roni.
Masheroni and...
Except his middle name is Renee.
Yes, it is. I listen to Final Fantasy IV for when I want to listen to a Final Fantasy soundtrack for fun. When I want to have the feels, that's when I pop in what I call the VI.
The venereal
infection also.
Oof.
What is clapping, really? Clapping is...
It's love persevering.
Can clapping bloom on a battlefield? Yep, there we go. Making content.
Okay, I'm going to stop recording.
I want to make pro-tent. Because I'm not negative like the world is. Please don't start World War III.